In the sprawling mansion at the edge of Providence, where whispers replaced conversation and shadows moved with purpose, little Rosie hadn't spoken a word in 247 days. The day her mother's casket descended into the cold New England soil was the day her voice disappeared, as if buried alongside the only person who truly understood her heart. Men in expensive suits moved cautiously around her, these hardened criminals who could make grown men tremble, with a glance reduced to awkward, helpless figures in the presence of a silent 7-year-old. Her father, Salvatore Bianchi, the most feared man in 3 states, had conquered territories and crushed rivals, yet couldn't breach the walls his daughter had built around herself. The finest child psychologists had come and gone, their sophisticated techniques crumbling against Rosie's resolute silence. Her room remained a shrine to what once was, toys untouched, books unread, the curtains perpetually drawn against a world that had taken too much from her. At night, when the mansion grew quiet and the guards changed shifts, her father would sit outside her bedroom door, head in his hands. The mighty Bianchi, who controlled everything from dock workers to judges, powerless against the grief that had stolen his daughter's voice and left a ghost in her place. Rosie would sit for hours by the window overlooking the garden where her mother had once planted roses, her small fingers tracing patterns on the glass. The staff whispered that she was broken beyond repair, a tragic figure in a house built on fear and respect. When Salvatore hosted business meetings, associates' eyes would drift to the small figure who haunted the hallways like a specter, her dark eyes observing everything yet connecting with nothing. They pitied the boss not for his enemies, but for the battle he couldn't win with threats or money. The household staff moved around her like she was made of glass, afraid that the wrong word or gesture might shatter what fragile existence remained. Her school uniforms hung unworn, her backpack collecting dust. Education seemed pointless when the child refused to engage with the world. 5 nannies had quit, unable to bear the weight of caring for a child who stared through them as if they were ghosts. The last one left in tears, claiming there was something unsettling about a child who watched everything, but participated in nothing. Salvatore had begun to believe the whispers that perhaps his daughter would never return from the abyss of her grief. The empire he had built seemed hollow now, its purpose lost when he looked into his daughter's empty eyes, and found no reflection of himself or the future he had imagined. The teachers from her former private school occasionally sent letters, inquiring about her return, but these remained unopened on Salvatore's desk. What use were academics when the fundamental human connection of speech had been severed? For her 7th birthday, Salvatore had transformed the grounds into a carnival, complete with rides and games, hoping to spark joy in his daughter's heart. Rosie had walked through it all, touching nothing, saying nothing, her small hand limp in his as if the very act of holding on required too much energy. The staff began to wonder if the boss's heart was changing, softening under the constant strain of his daughter's silence. The man who once ordered executions without blinking now spent hours researching childhood trauma and grief counseling techniques. In the 3rd-floor east wing, where Rosie's bedroom overlooked the garden her mother had loved, a half-finished puzzle lay on a table, the only activity that seemed to hold her attention, if only for moments. The pieces, like her scattered thoughts, refused to form a complete picture. The whispers around Providence grew louder. The invincible Don Bianchi had finally met an adversary he couldn't defeat. Some rivals began testing boundaries, sensing weakness in an organization led by a man distracted by personal tragedy. At night, when her father thought she was sleeping, Rosie would carefully arrange her mother's photographs in a circle around her pillow, creating a barrier against nightmares. The household staff found them each morning, but no one dared disturb this ritual, this silent prayer to a mother who could no longer protect her child. The cleaning service agency hesitated when they received the request from the Bianchi estate, knowing the rumors about what happened to people who disappointed the family. Most cleaners refused the assignment outright, fear outweighing the exceptional pay offered for maintaining the sprawling mansion on the hill. Margaret Walsh didn't have the luxury of fear, not with rent 3 months overdue, and the hospital bills still arriving with alarming regularity. The memorial cards for her son Timothy were still on her kitchen counter, their edges worn from her fingers tracing his smiling face each morning before she forced herself to face another day. Before the accident that took her 4-year-old son, Margaret had been a preschool teacher, beloved by children for her gentle patience and creative approach to learning. Now she could barely look at children without feeling her heart splinter into smaller fragments. The agency manager had pulled her aside, explaining in hushed tones exactly whose house she would be cleaning. They're particular about things being just so, and they don't like questions or chatter, he warned, not mentioning the darker rumors that circulated about the family's business practices. On her first day, Margaret kept her head down as security checked her credentials at the gate, 3 armed men escorting her to the service entrance. The mansion felt like a mausoleum, oppressively silent, despite the dozen staff members moving efficiently through their tasks. She was assigned to the East Wing, the guard's instructions precise and limiting. Certain rooms were off-limits, certain items were not to be touched, and under no circumstances was she to interact with family members. The warning seemed unnecessary. The halls were empty, devoid of life despite their opulence. As she methodically worked through the assigned rooms, Margaret became aware of a presence, a small girl watching her from doorways, disappearing when noticed. Like a ghost playing a game of hide-and-seek, the child seemed to materialize and vanish without sound. During her lunch break, sitting alone in the staff kitchen, Margaret overheard 2 security guards discussing the boss's problem in low voices. "It's been 8 months, and the kid still won't talk to anyone, not even him," one murmured, genuine concern evident beneath his gruff exterior. Margaret recognized the symptoms immediately from her teaching background. Selective mutism triggered by severe trauma, the mind's way of protecting itself when reality became too painful to process. She'd had a student once, a boy whose father had died suddenly, who didn't speak for 3 months. The next day, Margaret brought her cleaning cart to the library, where she'd glimpsed the child hiding behind heavy curtains. Without acknowledging her presence, Margaret began humming softly, an old lullaby she used to sing to Timothy, while dusting the endless rows of leather-bound books. From the corner of her eye, she saw tiny fingers reach out from behind the curtain, tracing the pattern of the oriental rug. Margaret continued working, carefully maintaining the pretense that she hadn't noticed, understanding intuitively that direct attention might cause the child to retreat. When she returned the following day, there was a crude drawing left, precisely where her cart had been positioned, a stick figure with a mop, and what appeared to be a smile. Margaret slipped the paper into her pocket before the guards could see it, a forbidden interaction she instinctively kept secret. That night in her bare apartment, Margaret studied the drawing, the first genuine emotional connection she'd felt since Timothy's funeral. She carefully placed it on her refrigerator next to her son's last artwork. 2 broken worlds momentarily bridged by crayon and innocence. She began leaving small, inconspicuous gifts where the child might find them. A perfect maple leaf pressed between paper towels, a small origami bird fashioned from cleaning cloth, a heart drawn in condensation on a window. Nothing that would alert security, nothing that could be traced back to her. The girl began following her more openly, maintaining distance but watching intently as Margaret cleaned and organized. Sometimes Margaret would narrate what she was doing in a soft, gentle monologue, the way she used to explain the world to her preschool students and to Timothy. On the 3rd week, Margaret found a small treasure left in her cleaning cart, a handcrafted rabbit missing 1 ear, clearly well-loved and precious to its owner. Her hands trembled as she carefully placed it in the pocket of her uniform, understanding the magnitude of this trust. That evening, she carefully stitched a new ear for the rabbit using fabric from one of Timothy's old blankets, her fingers remembering skills she thought grief had taken from her. She added a tiny heart stitched on its chest, a silent message of understanding from one broken heart to another. The next morning, hidden cameras captured the moment when Margaret slipped the repaired rabbit into the gap between the bookshelf and wall, where she'd seen small fingers retreating. Hours later, those same cameras recorded Rosie retrieving it, her expression changing for the first time in months as she noticed the repair. Salvatore Bianchi, reviewing security footage as he did obsessively since his wife's death, froze the frame on his daughter's face. The subtle shift in her expression, not quite a smile but no longer the empty mask he'd grown accustomed to, made his heart stutter with hope and suspicion. He summoned his head of security, requesting detailed background information on the new cleaning woman. "Everything, Paul. I want to know who she is, where she came from, and why my daughter is responding to her when she's ignored every professional we've brought in." The report arrived on his desk the following morning. Margaret Walsh, 34, former preschool teacher, widow son, deceased in a car accident 18 months prior. Clean record, no connections to rival families or law enforcement, drowning in medical debt despite insurance. Salvatore studied her photograph, trying to understand what made this ordinary-looking woman different from the specialists and caretakers who had failed to reach Rosie. There was something in her eyes that resonated with him, a familiar grief that no amount of money or power could erase. He instructed security to modify the surveillance protocol. Watch them, but don't interfere unless absolutely necessary. For the first time since his wife's death, Salvatore felt a flicker of something beyond the grinding responsibility of maintaining his empire while raising a traumatized child. Margaret noticed the change immediately. Guards maintaining greater distance, doors to previously restricted areas mysteriously unlocked, her access to the house expanding without explanation. The invisible chess game being played around her made her nervous, but her growing connection to the silent child kept her returning. One rainy afternoon, as thunder cracked outside the library windows, Margaret found Rosie curled in a window seat, eyes wide with fear at each lightning flash. Without hesitation, she sat beside her, not touching but close enough to offer security, and began telling a story about rain fairies collecting water for forest creatures. To Margaret's astonishment, the child leaned against her arm as the story continued, a physical connection that brought tears to her eyes. Through the hidden camera, Salvatore watched this simple interaction, his throat tight with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. That night, Margaret found an envelope in her bag containing 3 months' worth of her outstanding rent in cash and a note with a single typed sentence, "Whatever you're doing, please don't stop." The handwriting was bold and masculine, the paper expensive, the message clear in its desperation. The following day, Margaret brought a small battery-operated planetarium, setting it up in the library without explanation. When darkness fell, she switched it on, transforming the ceiling into a swirling galaxy of stars and planets, a perfect recreation of the night sky Timothy had loved so much. Rosie's face in the starlight showed wonder, her small hand reaching upward as if to touch the projected constellations. Margaret softly named each one, explaining the myths behind them, creating a magical world where loss wasn't the end of the story but merely a transformation into something new. From his office, watching on the security monitor, Salvatore witnessed his daughter's face come alive in ways he had forgotten were possible. He poured himself a drink with trembling hands, torn between hope that Margaret could heal his daughter and fear of the vulnerability this represented. The quiet revolution happening in the East Wing did not go unnoticed by Salvatore's underboss, Bruno, whose loyalty to the family was exceeded only by his suspicion of outsiders. He'd seen empires crumble from within, starting with seemingly innocent infiltrations by those who appeared harmless. Bruno instructed 2 of his most trusted men to observe the cleaner's movements, convinced her influence over Rosie must have an ulterior motive. In his world, kindness was merely a mask for something more sinister, a philosophy that had kept him alive through 3 territory wars. Margaret sensed the increased scrutiny, the weight of unseen eyes following her through the mansion's corridors. She continued her work with practiced efficiency, her outward calm masking the anxiety that bubbled beneath the surface like a pot about to boil over. What neither Bruno nor his men could comprehend was the silent language developing between Margaret and Rosie, a glance that conveyed understanding, a small object left as a message, the careful positioning of books to create codes only they understood. Their shared grief had forged a connection deeper than words. In Rosie's room, previously untouched toys began appearing in new arrangements, evidence of play happening when no one was watching. The pristine bedsheets showed signs of use, the dust on her bookshelf disappeared, small but significant shifts that hinted at a child gradually returning to life. Salvatore began rescheduling meetings to coincide with Margaret's cleaning schedule, finding reasons to pass by the library or garden when she might be there with Rosie. He observed their interactions from a distance, studying the woman who had accomplished what his money and power could not. One rainy afternoon, as Margaret organized books in the library, she felt a presence behind her that wasn't Rosie's. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with Salvatore Bianchi, his imposing figure softened by the unmistakable weariness of a parent worn thin by worry. "You were a teacher," he stated rather than asked, his voice low and controlled despite the intensity of his gaze. Margaret nodded, her hands instinctively tightening around the book she held, a shield against the power this man represented. What passed between them in that moment wasn't spoken, a recognition of shared pain, a mutual understanding that they were 2 adults orbiting a child's grief, each with their own reasons for needing to help her find her way back. Salvatore left without another word, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The next day, Margaret found her cleaning cart upgraded, the supplies replaced with professional-grade materials, and a small note, "Whatever she needs." No signature was necessary. The message was clear in its simplicity, and the implied permission to continue her unorthodox approach. In the garden where Rosie's mother had once tended roses, Margaret discovered the child attempting to water long-dead plants. Her small face concentrated on the task, as if she could bring them back through sheer determination. Instead of explaining that the flowers were gone, Margaret brought seed packets the following day. Together they dug in the soil, Margaret demonstrating while Rosie mimicked her movements, planting bulbs that would sleep through winter before blooming in spring. The metaphor wasn't lost on the security cameras capturing the moment, nor on Salvatore watching the feed from his office with a tumbler of scotch in his hand. Bruno's reports grew more urgent, as Rosie began leaving her room voluntarily, seeking out Margaret during her shifts, the security footage showing the child following the cleaner like a shadow. "We know nothing about her," Bruno insisted during a private meeting, "except that she's gaining influence over your daughter, and by extension, you." Salvatore's response was uncharacteristically philosophical. Sometimes the most dangerous person is the one who makes you hope again. He dismissed Bruno's concerns, but doubled the background checks on Margaret, diving deeper into her past, seeking any connection to rivals or law enforcement that might explain her effect on Rosie. What they found instead was heartbreak. Newspaper clippings of the accident that claimed Timothy Walsh's life, medical records showing Margaret's subsequent hospitalization for what was clinically termed acute stress reaction, and the systematic dismantling of a life once built around educating children, now reduced to cleaning houses to survive. The first word came unexpectedly, during a moment so ordinary it might have been missed, if not for the absolute silence that had preceded it. Margaret was wiping windows in the library, singing softly to herself, when a small voice behind her said simply, "Blue." The cloth slipped from Margaret's fingers as she turned, finding Rosie pointing at the sky visible through the freshly cleaned glass. The single word hung between them, precious and fragile as a soap bubble, neither wanting to acknowledge it too directly for fear it might disappear. Margaret continued cleaning, her heart racing beneath her calm exterior, responding with casual warmth. "Yes, it's very blue today, isn't it? The kind of blue that makes you think summer might last forever." She resisted the urge to report this breakthrough, understanding instinctively that pressure would only drive Rosie back into silence. Unknown to Margaret, every sound in the Bianchi mansion was recorded, every security feed analyzed. Within minutes, Salvatore had been notified that his daughter had spoken for the first time in 8 months, the single word, blue, prompting an emergency rescheduling of a meeting with rival family representatives. Bruno interpreted this development differently, seeing it as proof that the cleaner had established a dangerous level of influence. "She's gotten the girl to speak when specialists couldn't," he argued during a tense meeting with Salvatore. "We need to know what she's saying to her when cameras aren't watching." The following morning, Margaret found herself invited to Salvatore's office, a summons delivered by a stone-faced security guard that offered no opportunity for refusal. The journey through the mansion's west wing revealed a different world, one of business and power rather than domestic life. Salvatore stood when she entered, a courtesy that surprised her, gesturing to a chair across from his imposing desk. "My daughter spoke yesterday," he stated, eyes studying her reaction. "One word, but it's the first sound she's made since her mother's funeral." Margaret met his gaze steadily, sensing that her response would be measured carefully. "Children heal in their own time, Mr. Bianchi. Rosie's silence isn't stubbornness or defiance. It's protection against a world that became too painful too suddenly." A muscle twitched in Salvatore's jaw, the only indication that her words had affected him. "You lost a child," he said after a long pause. "My security team says that's why you understand her, why you can reach her when others can't." The directness of his statement stripped away Margaret's professional veneer, leaving her vulnerable in a room with a man known for exploiting weakness. "Yes," she replied simply. "I know what it's like when grief takes your voice. Sometimes the only people who can hear you are those who've experienced the same silence." Salvatore rose abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the garden where Margaret and Rosie had planted bulbs. "Her mother was killed in a targeted hit meant for me," he revealed, his back to Margaret, shoulders rigid with the confession. "Rosie was in the car. They pulled her out before setting it on fire. A mercy from people who wanted me to live with the consequences rather than die quickly." Margaret absorbed this information without visible reaction, though her mind raced with implications. "And you've been keeping Rosie isolated since then, surrounded by security, afraid they might come back for her," she concluded, understanding now why the child's world had shrunk to the confines of the mansion. "I've been keeping her alive," Salvatore corrected, turning back to face Margaret with an intensity that made her breath catch. But I'm beginning to wonder if there's a difference between surviving and living, and which one I've condemned her to. The request, when it came, was not what Margaret expected. Salvatore asked her to expand her role beyond cleaning, to spend structured time with Rosie daily, to create a routine that might help the child reclaim some normalcy. The salary he offered was more than she'd made as a teacher, enough to clear her debts and start fresh. Bruno's objections were overruled, though his concerns about security protocols for the new arrangement created tension within the household. Additional cameras were installed in areas where Margaret and Rosie spent time together, guards positioned within earshot but out of sight. The annual gathering of Bianchi family associates was a tradition dating back generations, a display of power and unity that no personal tragedy could be allowed to disrupt. Rosie had been informed she would make an appearance, her first formal introduction to the wider family circle since her mother's death. Margaret spent the morning helping her prepare, styling her hair with gentle hands, and telling stories about brave princesses who faced dragons, a transparent metaphor for the evening ahead. Rosie remained mostly silent, though she now occasionally offered single words. Pretty, scared, stay, each one treasured like rare gems. The child's dress, selected by a stylist under Salvatore's direction, was age-appropriate yet clearly expensive, a reminder of her position as heir to an empire built in shadows. Margaret fastened the pearl buttons up the back with steady fingers, pretending not to notice how the child trembled beneath the fabric. As evening approached, Rosie's anxiety manifested physically. Her breathing quickened, her small hands cold and clammy when Margaret held them. "Remember, you can come back to your room whenever you want," Margaret reassured her, knowing Salvatore had agreed to this escape clause after lengthy discussion. The ballroom gleamed with crystal and polished silver, dozens of conversations hushing momentarily as Salvatore entered with Rosie's hand clasped firmly in his. Margaret watched from a strategic position near a service entrance, close enough to intervene if needed but invisible to most guests. Rosie's composure lasted exactly 27 minutes before the combination of unfamiliar faces, loud conversations, and a champagne glass shattering nearby triggered a response that no one was prepared for. The child's scream cut through the elegant murmur of the gathering like a knife, her body collapsing to the floor as she curled into herself, hands over her ears. Security responded instantly, moving toward Rosie with hands on concealed weapons, scanning for external threats while guests backed away in confusion and alarm. Salvatore froze, caught between his roles as father and leader, the dual responsibilities momentarily paralyzing his response. Margaret moved without conscious thought, pushing past guards and guests alike to reach the child huddled on the polished marble floor. She knelt beside Rosie, creating a physical barrier between her and the startled onlookers, her voice low and steady as she guided the child through breathing exercises practiced during quieter moments. "Just like we talked about, Rosie. In through your nose while I count to 4, hold for 4, out through your mouth for 4, Margaret murmured, demonstrating the rhythm without touching the child, respecting the invisible boundary that panic had erected around her. Salvatore watched as his daughter gradually calmed under Margaret's guidance, her breathing slowing, her rigid posture softening incrementally. The gathered associates witnessed something few had seen before, uncertainty in their leader's eyes, a vulnerability that business rivals would interpret as weakness. Bruno moved efficiently through the crowd, redirecting attention, offering drinks and conversation, while subtly positioning loyal family members between the scene and any guests whose loyalty might be questionable. The damage control was seamless, but the incident had been observed and would be remembered. Margaret helped Rosie to her feet once the worst had passed, supporting her without seeming to as they made their way toward the nearest exit. Salvatore followed at a distance, maintaining his composure through decades of practice control while his world shifted beneath his feet. In Rosie's room, with the door closed against the continuing festivities below, Margaret helped the child change into comfortable pajamas, neither mentioning the tears that occasionally slipped down Rosie's cheeks. They built a fort of blankets and pillows, creating a safe cave illuminated by the star projector, a sanctuary against the overwhelming world outside. Salvatore found them there an hour later, Margaret reading softly from a book about a lost bear finding his way home, Rosie's eyes heavy with approaching sleep. He stood in the doorway, watching this tableau of ordinary comfort that had been absent from his daughter's life for too long. When Rosie finally drifted to sleep, Margaret carefully extracted herself from the blanket fort, finding Salvatore still in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You knew exactly what to do," he said quietly as they stepped into the hallway, his question implicit in the statement. Bruno's network of informants brought troubling news. A rival family had discovered Salvatore's growing attachment to the cleaning woman and his daughter's improvement under her care. This vulnerability, this newfound emotional dependence, was being discussed in back rooms where business was conducted through whispers and blood. In the shadowy world where the Bianchis operated, personal attachments were liabilities, leverage points that could be exploited by enemies seeking advantage. Bruno presented his concerns during a private meeting. Surveillance photos spread across Salvatore's desk, showing Margaret and Rosie in the garden, at the library, moments of connection documented as evidence of danger. "She's not just helping the girl, boss," Bruno insisted, tapping a particularly clear image of Salvatore watching the pair from a distance, his expression unguarded. "She's changing you, and people are noticing. The Pescaros are saying you've gone soft, that you're distracted, that maybe it's time for new leadership in Providence." Salvatore's response was ice cold, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping as he leaned forward. "Is that what you think, Bruno? That allowing my daughter to heal is a sign of weakness? That finding someone who can help her means I've lost my edge?" The threat beneath his measured tone was unmistakable. Bruno had served the family too long to be intimidated easily, his loyalty buying him the right to speak difficult truths. "What I think is that you've given this woman access not just to your home, but to your heart, and we know nothing about her except what's on paper. Papers can be falsified, backgrounds manufactured. Mom, the seed of doubt, once planted, grew rapidly in soil fertilized by decades of necessary paranoia. Salvatore authorized deeper investigations into Margaret's past, interviews with former colleagues, surveillance of her apartment, and analysis of her financial transactions, searching for any suspicious patterns. What they discovered instead were the mundane details of a life shattered by loss, therapy sessions she could barely afford, a small box of her son's belongings she still couldn't bring herself to donate, evening classes in child psychology taken in a desperate attempt to understand why her son had been taken from her. Despite the evidence of Margaret's innocence, Bruno remained convinced that her influence represented danger. His concerns gained traction when intelligence reports confirmed that the Pescaro family was indeed watching the Bianchi household closely, particularly Margaret's comings and goings, which followed predictable patterns that made her an easy target. The warning came from an unexpected source, a police detective with ties to the Bianchi organization, who reported increased surveillance activity around Margaret's apartment building. "They're not watching her because she's a threat," the detective explained during a clandestine meeting. "They're watching her because you care about her, and that makes her valuable." Salvatore faced an impossible choice: remove Margaret from their lives, severing the connection that had brought Rosie back from the edge of a bottomless grief, or keep her close, knowing that her presence painted a target on her back that grew larger with each day she remained in their orbit. The decision was taken out of his hands when Margaret's apartment was broken into while she was working at the mansion. Nothing was taken, but every photo of her son had been arranged in a circle on her bed, a message that required no translation. "We know what matters to you. We know how to hurt you." When informed of the break-in, Margaret's face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of Salvatore's desk with white-knuckle intensity. "They found Timothy's things," she whispered, the implication clear. Strangers had touched her most precious memories, violated the shrine she had created to her son's short life. Salvatore's response was immediate and non-negotiable. Margaret would move into the estate's guest house effective immediately, her apartment leased to someone else under a different name, her remaining possessions transferred under heavy guard. The walls that protected his family would now extend to include her. Bruno objected strenuously, arguing that bringing Margaret closer was exactly what their enemies wanted, creating a consolidated target rather than distributed vulnerabilities. "You're thinking with your heart, not your head," he warned during a heated exchange that ended with Salvatore reminding him sharply of the chain of command. The guest house transformation occurred with military precision. Security systems upgraded, bulletproof glass installed, panic buttons positioned strategically throughout the small but elegant space. What had once been designed for visiting associates became a fortress within a fortress. A visual representation of Margaret's new status within the Bianchi hierarchy. The morning after Margaret moved into the guest house, Rosie appeared at her door unescorted, clutching her repaired rabbit and a small backpack. "Breakfast," she said simply, the single word an invitation rather than a request. her free hand extended with an expectancy that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Together they walked to the main house, trailed at a discreet distance by security personnel, who had clearly been instructed to allow this unprecedented independence. In the kitchen, the staff glanced curiously at Margaret in her civilian clothes, rather than her cleaner's uniform, this visual signifier of her altered position, creating ripples of speculation throughout the household. Salvatore joined them halfway through their meal, his entrance causing an immediate exodus of kitchen staff seeking to give the unusual trio privacy. He poured coffee with his own hands, a domestic gesture at odds with the power he wielded beyond these walls, his eyes frequently darting to Rosie as she arranged fruit into patterns on her plate. "I need to attend to business matters today," he announced, directing his words primarily to Margaret, though his eyes remained on his daughter. "There have been complications requiring my personal attention. Paul will remain here with additional security. No one leaves the property until I return." After he departed, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted perceptibly, Bruno's authority filling the vacuum left by Salvatore's absence. He made no attempt to hide his surveillance of Margaret and Rosie, his presence a constant shadow as they moved through their day, his disapproval evident in every terse instruction to the security team. In the library that afternoon, as Margaret helped Rosie with basic reading exercises, the child surprised her with a complete sentence, her first since the trauma. "Why doesn't Bruno like you?" she asked, her voice rusty from disuse, but her perception razor-sharp, missing nothing despite her silence. Margaret chose her words carefully, aware of the microphones undoubtedly recording their conversation. "Sometimes people worry about change, especially when they care deeply about protecting someone they love. Bruno wants to keep you and your father safe, and sometimes new people seem like they might be dangerous." Rosie considered this explanation with solemn eyes that had witnessed more violence than any child should. "You're not dangerous," she stated with absolute conviction, returning to her book as if the matter was settled, unaware of the profound effect her words had on the adults listening through security feeds. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed in the guest house, the security alarm chimed softly, announcing an authorized visitor. Salvatore stood at her door, his customary suit replaced by more casual attire, a bottle of wine in one hand, and a haunted expression that spoke of difficult decisions made and implemented. "The Pescaro underboss won't be a problem anymore," he said without preamble as she let him in, the statement hanging between them like a test. Would she ask for details she was better off not knowing? Or would she accept the reality of who he was and what his world required? Margaret's response surprised both of them. She took the wine bottle from his hand and moved to the kitchen for glasses, her silence neither condemnation nor approval, but simple acceptance of complexities beyond her control. "Rosie formed a complete sentence today," she offered instead, changing the subject to safer ground. They sat in her small living room, the security monitors visible on her wall displaying the perimeter of the guest house, a constant reminder of danger and protection. "Bruno doesn't trust me," Margaret stated after her first sip of wine. "He believes I'm a weakness in your organization, a way for your enemies to hurt you through Rosie." Salvatore's laugh held no humor. "Bruno doesn't trust anyone, including himself most days. But he's not wrong. Caring about people is dangerous in my world. It creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited." He studied her over the rim of his glass, searching for judgment or fear and finding neither. "I understood what I was walking into when I moved here," Margaret replied, her gaze steady and direct. "I've spent 18 months drowning in grief for my son, going through motions that looked like living but weren't. Helping Rosie has helped me too. Some risks are worth taking." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of truths too complicated for simple definition. They talked for hours, about Rosie's progress, about Timothy, about the wife and mother whose absences had shaped them all, their conversation carefully avoiding the bloodier aspects of Salvatore's business, while never pretending they didn't exist. Dawn was breaking when Salvatore finally left, their connection deepened by shared vulnerability and mutual respect. Neither could have predicted that as they spoke, Bruno was meeting with associates concerned about the family's changing dynamics, men who saw Salvatore's evolving priorities as evidence of weakness rather than growth. The warehouse on the outskirts of Providence had served as a Bianchi distribution center for decades, its unremarkable exterior concealing operations that generated millions in revenue annually. On a rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon, it became something else entirely, the backdrop for a power struggle that had been brewing since Margaret entered their lives. Salvatore received the call during a rare moment of normalcy. He'd been watching Margaret help Rosie plant flowers in small pots for her windowsill, the domestic tranquility a sharp contrast to the message delivered in his security chief's tense voice. Bruno's called a meeting at the waterfront facility. They're saying it's about the future of the family business. The code was clear to anyone who had navigated family politics for as long as Salvatore had. This was a challenge to his leadership, a calculated move while his attention was divided between business and the growing attachment to the woman who had transformed his daughter's life. He left immediately, increasing security around the mansion with a terseness that betrayed his concern. Margaret noticed the additional guards, the heightened vigilance that descended over the estate in Salvatore's absence. She maintained Rosie's routine with forced calm, reading stories and completing simple art projects, while carefully monitoring the silent communications passing between security personnel. The hours stretched painfully, as afternoon faded to evening with no word from Salvatore. Paul, the head of household security, began checking his watch with increasing frequency, his hand never straying far from the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. When the call finally came, his face transformed from professional detachment to genuine alarm. "Get them to the panic room," he ordered the nearest guards. All pretense of normal operations abandoned as he strode toward Margaret and Rosie in the library. "Now, no questions. Move." His urgency brooked no argument as he herded them toward the concealed entrance behind a bookcase that Margaret had only been shown theoretically during her security briefing. Inside the fortified space, with steel doors sealing them from the outside world, Paul finally explained, Salvatore had been ambushed at the warehouse, Bruno's loyalty proven false by a carefully orchestrated coup attempt. "The boss is alive," he assured them, though his expression suggested the situation remained dire. "But there's a cleanup operation underway. You'll stay here until we're certain the property is secure." Hours passed in the windowless room, Rosie eventually falling asleep on the small bed, while Margaret remained awake, her mind constructing and discarding scenarios of what might be happening beyond their shelter. When the door finally opened, she expected Paul or another security team member, not Salvatore himself, his expensive suit stained with substances she chose not to identify, his expression hardened by whatever had transpired. "It's over," he stated simply, his eyes softening as they found Rosie sleeping peacefully despite the chaos that had erupted around their carefully constructed new normal. "Bruno miscalculated how many men would follow him. Those who remained loyal have been rewarded. Those who didn't?" He left the sentence unfinished, unnecessary details hanging in the space between them. Margaret approached him slowly, her eyes cataloging the small injuries visible on his face and hands, defensive wounds that told a story of direct conflict rather than ordered execution. Without speaking, she led him to the small bathroom in the corner of the panic room, wetting a clean towel to gently wipe blood from a cut above his eyebrow. The intimacy of the gesture suspended them in a moment, outside the violence of the day, Salvatore's breath catching as her fingers brushed against his temple. "You should be afraid of me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "After what I did today, what I've done my whole life, you should be running as far from me as possible." Margaret's hands remained steady as she continued cleaning his wounds. "I'm not naive about who you are, or what your business entails," she replied quietly, mindful of Rosie sleeping nearby. "I made my choice when I moved into the guest house. I choose to see the father who would burn down the world to protect his daughter, not just the man who controls Providence through fear." Something broke open in Salvatore then, a dam of emotion held in check by decades of necessary ruthlessness. He pulled Margaret against him, his embrace fierce and desperate, seeking connection rather than passion, affirmation of humanity when he had spent the day demonstrating its absence. She held him without hesitation, offering strength rather than taking it. Later, with Rosie awake and the three of them escorted back to the main house under heavy guard, Margaret watched as Salvatore knelt before his daughter, explaining in simple terms that bad men had tried to hurt them, but were now gone. The child's response astonished them both. She reached out to touch her father's injured face with gentle fingers, then turned to Margaret with perfect clarity in her eyes. "You fixed my rabbit. Can you fix Daddy too?" In the weeks that followed, as Providence's underworld adjusted to the reminder of Salvatore's ruthless efficiency, the Bianchi household underwent its own revolution. Margaret's role evolved from unofficial therapist to something more integral, her presence at family meals and business functions becoming expected rather than exceptional. Rosie's progress accelerated with stability. Full sentences gave way to paragraphs. Silence transformed into occasional laughter. She began asking questions about her mother, retrieving memories long suppressed by trauma. Grief, finally finding healthy expression through stories and shared remembrance. The first time Salvatore kissed Margaret was in the garden Rosie had helped restore, surrounded by blooms that symbolized renewal and second chances. The moment was unplanned, growing naturally from a conversation about the future, about possibilities neither had dared consider during their darkest days of grief. Rosie found them there, her small face lighting with understanding beyond her years. "Are we going to be a family now?" she asked, the directness of childhood cutting through adult complications with perfect precision. The question hung in the summer air, weighted with potential and fragile hope. "I think perhaps we already are," Salvatore answered, looking to Margaret for confirmation, for permission to believe in something he had never thought possible. Redemption through love rather than penance through isolation. Her smile was answer enough, the three of them connected by loss and healing and unexpected second chances. 6 months later, as autumn painted Providence in amber and gold, Margaret officially adopted Rosie in a private ceremony, attended only by those who had earned absolute trust. The paperwork made official what had already been true, that families are sometimes formed in the aftermath of shattering loss, built from broken pieces that fit together in unexpected ways. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, because your support is important for me to continue creating here.